What happens when one of music's most beloved icons goes head-to-head with television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Cher sits down with Bill Maher, and what starts as political banter quickly spirals into the most explosive confrontation late-night television has ever witnessed. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a complete meltdown that has the entire entertainment industry talking. Last night's episode of Real Time with Bill Maher was supposed to be a straightforward discussion about Cher's decades-long career and her recent political activism. Instead, viewers witnessed something unprecedented, a verbal battle that escalated so quickly and so intensely that it left studio audiences gasping and social media exploding with reactions. What started as seemingly innocent questions about her support for various causes quickly transformed into a personal attack that would ultimately force the legendary performer to make a decision that shocked everyone watching. The tension was palpable from the moment Cher walked onto the set. She appeared confident, radiant in her signature style, but there was something in her demeanor that suggested she wasn't going to tolerate any nonsense tonight. Maher, known for his provocative interviewing style and tendency to push boundaries, seemed particularly eager to dive into controversial territory. The stage was set for what would become a confrontation that nobody saw coming. "Cher, welcome to the show," Maher began with his characteristic smirk. "I have to say, you've been pretty vocal about politics lately. Some might say you've been a bit dramatic about it all." The word dramatic hung in the air like a challenge, and Cher's expression immediately shifted. Her smile tightened, and her eyes narrowed slightly. The first sign that this conversation was about to take an unexpected turn. "Bill, I've been fighting for what I believe in for over 50 years, Cher responded, her voice steady but edged with warning. "If standing up for human rights and democracy makes me dramatic, then I guess I'm guilty as charged." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, a defensive posture that Maher seemed to interpret as an invitation to push harder. "But don't you think there's a difference between advocacy and, well, hysteria?" Maher pressed, his tone becoming more condescending with each word. "I mean, some of your tweets have been pretty over the top, even for someone with your theatrical background." The studio audience began to murmur uncomfortably, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Cher's jaw tightened visibly, and she leaned forward slightly, her famous composure beginning to crack. "Hysteria?" Cher repeated, her voice rising just enough to cut through the tension. "Are you seriously going to sit there and call my concern for this country hysteria? When democracy is literally under attack, when people's rights are being stripped away, when families are being torn apart, you want to call my response hysteria?" The fire in her eyes was unmistakable now, and even Maher seemed momentarily taken aback by the intensity of her reaction. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Look, I'm not saying you don't have the right to your opinions, but when you're posting things like, 'The world is ending and we're all doomed,' doesn't that strike you as maybe a little bit unhinged?" The word unhinged landed like a slap across the face, and the studio fell into complete silence. Cher's mouth fell open in shock, and for a moment she seemed genuinely speechless. "Did you just call me unhinged?" she asked, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "Are you out of your mind? I've been in this business longer than you've been alive, and I've seen more, done more, and fought more battles than you could ever imagine. And you're going to sit there and call me unhinged for caring about people?" Her hands were shaking now, her voice growing louder with each sentence. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that this was spiraling out of control. Maher, however, seemed to be enjoying the chaos he had created. "I'm just saying that maybe, just maybe, you could tone it down a notch. Not everything is a crisis, Cher. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, you know." His dismissive tone and condescending smile were like gasoline on an already raging fire. "Don't you dare patronize me." "Bill!" Cher shot back, her voice now carrying the full weight of her fury. "You think this is funny? You think my concerns are some kind of joke? People are dying, Bill. People are suffering. And you want to make jokes about it? What kind of person does that make you?" She was leaning forward now, her finger pointed directly at him, her entire body language screaming confrontation. The tension in the studio was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Maher's smug expression began to falter as he realized he might have pushed too far, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. "I think it makes me someone who can see the bigger picture without getting caught up in emotional outbursts," he replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe that's something you should consider." That was the moment everything changed. Cher's eyes flashed with a fury that seemed to fill the entire studio, and her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Emotional outbursts. Emotional outbursts." She rose to her feet, towering over him despite having been seated just moments before. "You want to see an emotional outburst, Bill? Because I'm about to give you one you'll never forget." The audience was completely silent now, frozen in anticipation. Even the camera crew seemed to be holding their breath, uncertain whether to keep rolling or cut away. Maher's face had gone pale. For the first time in the conversation, he looked genuinely concerned about what he had unleashed. "Cher, maybe we should take a step back here," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. But it was too late. The damage was done, and Cher was just getting started. What happened next would become the stuff of television legend, but not in the way anyone expected. "Take a step back?" Cher's voice cut through the silence like a blade, dripping with contempt. "You want me to take a step back after you just spent the last 10 minutes trying to humiliate me on national television?" She moved closer to his desk, her presence commanding the entire studio. "You know what, Bill? I've been taking steps back my whole career. I've been told to sit down, shut up, and look pretty for decades. But not tonight. Tonight you picked the wrong woman to mess with." The studio lights seemed to dim around them as if the very atmosphere was responding to the intensity of her anger. Maher tried to regain control, gesturing weakly toward his notes. "Look, I was just trying to have a conversation." "A conversation?" Cher interrupted, her voice rising to fill every corner of the studio. "Is that what you call it? Because from where I'm standing, it looked a lot more like a character assassination attempt. You invited me here under false pretenses, didn't you? You never intended to discuss my career or my music. You brought me here to be your punching bag, to make yourself look clever at my expense." The accuracy of her accusation hit Maher like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed silently, searching for words that wouldn't come. The audience could sense his discomfort, and some began to shift in their seats, clearly uneasy with what they were witnessing. This wasn't the entertainment they had signed up for. This was becoming genuinely ugly. "You want to know what's unhinged, Bill?" Cher continued, her voice now carrying a deadly calm that was somehow more terrifying than her previous shouting. "What's unhinged is a man who makes millions of dollars pretending to care about important issues while simultaneously mocking the people who actually do something about them. What's unhinged is someone who thinks basic human empathy is a character flaw worth ridiculing on television." Maher finally found his voice, but it came out strained and defensive. "Now wait just a minute, Cher. I never said empathy was a character flaw. I was simply suggesting that maybe your approach could be more measured." His attempt to sound reasonable only seemed to fuel her fire further. "Measured?" Cher laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Measured like the way you measured your words tonight? Measured like the way you carefully planned to ambush me? Tell me, Bill, how long did you spend preparing those little insults? How many meetings did you have with your writers to come up with the perfect way to tear me down?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Maher's face flushed red, and his hands began to fidget with his papers. That's not what happened, he stammered. But his denial lacked conviction. The audience was watching this exchange with growing discomfort, some beginning to murmur among themselves. "Oh, it's not?" Cher pressed, sensing his weakness. "Then explain to me how you managed to turn every single question into an attack on my character. Explain to me how a discussion about my activism became a lecture about my supposed mental state. That doesn't happen by accident, Bill. That's calculated. That's deliberate. That's the kind of thing someone does when they're more interested in creating a spectacle than having an honest conversation." The truth in her words was undeniable, and Maher knew it. His usual quick wit had abandoned him completely, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in a way viewers had never seen before. He tried to salvage the situation with humor, his go-to defense mechanism. "Come on, Cher. You know I'm just trying to keep things lively here. It's television. It's supposed to be entertaining." That was the wrong thing to say. Cher's eyes flashed with renewed fury, and she stepped even closer to his desk. "Entertaining? You think humiliating your guests is entertaining? You think making people feel small and stupid is good television? Well, congratulations, Bill, because you've just created the most entertaining moment of your career. You've managed to show the entire world exactly what kind of person you really are." The studio had fallen into complete silence, except for the hum of the cameras and the sound of Cher's voice echoing off the walls. Even the production crew seemed frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let this train wreck continue. Maher was visibly sweating now, his confidence completely shattered. "I think maybe we should go to commercial," he said weakly, reaching for his emergency button, but Cher wasn't finished with him yet. "Oh no, you don't get to hide behind a commercial break," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You started this, Bill. You wanted to make a show of me, so let's make a show. Let's give your audience the full experience of what it's like to be on the receiving end of your brand of entertainment." The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Several audience members were looking toward the exits, clearly uncomfortable with the hostility they were witnessing. This had gone far beyond the usual heated debate that Maher's show was known for. This was personal, raw, and genuinely disturbing. "Cher, please," Maher tried one more time, his voice barely above a whisper. Can we just talk about this like adults?" Cher stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, a smile spread across her face. But it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized they held all the power in the room. "Adults," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You want to talk about this like adults? Fine. Let's talk about what adults do when they're treated with disrespect and contempt. Let's talk about what adults do when someone tries to make them look foolish on national television. Let's talk about what happens when you underestimate someone who has been fighting battles since before you were old enough to hold a microphone." The promise of what was coming next hung in the air, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Maher looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in the path of a hurricane with nowhere to run. "You know what, Bill?" Cher said, her voice now carrying the full weight of her decades in the entertainment industry. "I've been called a lot of things in my life. I've been called difficult, demanding, diva, all the usual words they use to dismiss women who refuse to be pushed around. But you know what? I've never been called unhinged. Because despite everything I've been through, despite all the battles I've fought, I've always maintained my dignity. Until tonight," she paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The studio was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "Tonight, you made me choose between my dignity and my self-respect. And you know what? I choose self-respect. I choose to stand up for myself instead of sitting here and taking your abuse with a smile." Maher's face had gone from pale to ashen. He was gripping his desk so hard his knuckles were white, and his usual smirk had been replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Cher, I never meant to—" "Oh, you meant every word," she cut him off, her voice like steel. "You meant every insult, every dismissive comment, every attempt to make me look foolish. But here's what you didn't count on. I'm not some starry-eyed ingenue who's going to crumble under your pressure. I'm Cher. I've survived everything this industry could throw at me. And I'm certainly not going to be taken down by a talk show host with a god complex." The audience was completely transfixed now. Some leaned forward in their seats. Others covered their mouths in shock. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. This was a masterclass in how to dismantle someone's entire persona in real time. "You want to know what's really unhinged, Bill?" Cher continued, her voice rising with each word. "What's unhinged is thinking you can invite someone onto your show, treat them like garbage, and expect them to just sit there and take it. What's unhinged is believing that your platform gives you the right to humiliate people for your own entertainment. What's unhinged is the arrogance it takes to think you can break down someone who has been unbreakable for over 50 years. Maher tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Look, maybe we both got a little heated here. Why don't we just— No." The single word came out with such force that it seemed to physically push Maher back in his chair. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to spend 20 minutes trying to destroy me and then act like it was just a little misunderstanding. You don't get to pretend this was mutual when you were the one throwing punches and I was the one defending myself." She turned to face the audience directly, her voice carrying to every corner of the studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here tonight expecting to see a conversation. Instead, you got to witness something much more revealing. You got to see what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, when someone confuses grace with vulnerability. You got to see what happens when a bully picks on the wrong person." The audience was mesmerized, hanging on her every word. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked at Maher with what could only be described as disgust. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Cher was now the one in control, and Maher was the one being judged. "I came here tonight to talk about my music. My career, my life's work," Cher continued, her voice now carrying a tone of profound disappointment. "Instead, I'm leaving here having learned something very important about the state of discourse in this country. I'm leaving here understanding why so many people are afraid to speak up, why so many celebrities stay silent on important issues. It's because they're terrified of being treated exactly the way I was treated tonight." She turned back to Maher, who was now slumped in his chair, looking smaller than anyone had ever seen him. "You want to know what the real tragedy is here, Bill? It's not that you tried to humiliate me. It's that you succeeded in showing everyone exactly who you really are. And that person is someone who uses their platform not to elevate important conversations, but to tear down anyone who dares to care about something more than their own ego." The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath, unsure whether to keep filming or look away from the complete destruction of their host's credibility. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Bill?" Cher asked, her voice now quiet, but carrying more power than when she was shouting. "I use my platform to lift people up. You use yours to tear them down. I use my voice to speak for those who can't speak for themselves. You use yours to mock people who actually give a damn about making the world a better place." She walked back to her chair, picked up her purse, and slung it over her shoulder with the same grace she'd shown walking onto the stage. But now there was something different about her, a quiet dignity that somehow made her appear 10 feet tall. "I've been in this business for over 50 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of every battle she'd ever fought and won. "I've seen hosts come and go. I've watched careers rise and fall. And I've learned one very important lesson. The way you treat people when you think you have all the power, Says everything about who you really are as a human being. She looked directly at Maher one last time, her expression a mixture of pity and disappointment. You had the opportunity tonight to have a real conversation with someone who has actually lived through history, someone who has fought real battles and made real change. Instead, you chose to try to score cheap points at my expense. That says everything anyone needs to know about you. The studio was so quiet that the sound of her heels clicking against the floor seemed to echo like thunder as she walked toward the exit. Maher finally found his voice, but it came out as barely a whisper. "Cher, wait." She stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back to face him one final time. "No, Bill, I'm done waiting. I'm done sitting quietly while people like you think you can treat me however you want. I'm done pretending that this kind of behavior is acceptable just because it's television." Her voice rose one last time, carrying across the studio with the force of decades of suppressed anger and hard-won wisdom. You wanted to see Unhinged. You wanted to see what happens when someone pushes Cher too far. Well, congratulations. You got your wish. But what you got wasn't a breakdown. It was a wake-up call. And I hope everyone watching tonight learned something about the difference between strength and cruelty, between honest discussion and calculated humiliation. She paused at the exit, her silhouette framed by the studio lights like a figure from a classic Hollywood movie. Good luck explaining this to your audience, Bill. Good luck explaining how you managed to turn what should have been a celebration of music and activism into a masterclass in how not to treat your guests. And good luck living with the fact that you just showed the entire world exactly what kind of person you really are. With that, she walked off the stage and out of the studio, leaving behind a silence so complete and devastating that it seemed to swallow the entire room. Maher sat frozen at his desk, staring at the empty space where she had been standing, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been shame. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of his stunned silence, every moment of his complete and utter defeat. The audience sat in stunned stillness, some wiping away tears, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of Cher's heels clicking down the hallway grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared entirely, leaving behind only the echo of her words and the devastating silence of a man who had finally met his match. Who do you think was right in this argument? Comment below